Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 12th video in our Master Series and the 6th video in our recording phase of this series. Tonight we are actually going to go through the recording process. The first thing I recommend is you go back and watch the first video from this recording phase in this Master Series so that you can go through and check the most important aspects of getting a good capture so that you can have really good material to work with and review that, because we talked about what are the most important aspects, getting to capturing the full spectrum and dB range of it with good dynamics, no distortion, clipping and saturation, no weak or quiet parts, things like that, and limiting background noise as much as possible to have as clean a capture as possible. It is hugely important because actual recording is not that difficult. We talked in the last video about your VST instruments, line inputs, or using a microphone, and to try to keep it very simple and just use the equipment properly so that you can do a good job with it and don't get lost in it like it's some kind of NASA thing. That it really, once you get really used to doing the things, that don't worry, you'll run into situations where you might have to get out a calculator and figure out what the heck is going on, and really get into some audio engineering concepts because of something is happening. But don't worry, right now that will be later. And for the most part, we want to avoid that as much as possible during this initial part. So we're ready for the actual recording process. So if you went back and watched that video, that you got a pretty good understanding of that. Now, on that video, we basically had this input that we had configured with those two compressors and a limiter. Now, one of the simple concepts that we talked about is using either your mixing board or your audio interface to start bringing the level up until you're getting to the levels that you want and hitting those compressors in the way that we had talked about. You can also put a trim pot on your track, or in my DAW, I basically have an input trim pot up at the top of the input to bring the level up or down a little bit, because there's been a couple times that I've recorded, my audio interface thing is just cranked up and I'm actually getting into red, so I have to back off a little bit so it's not showing red on my interface or my mixing board, and have to actually bring it up with a trim pot. And sometimes it's easier to work with that. Does that make sense? Just, get some type of workflow going so you're consistent about doing it. And, and also if you're using a VST instrument or a line input onto a track, that same configuration and signal, that system that is set up on that track also. Got those two compressors on there and that limiter set up with the view meters and the level meters before they hit those compressors limiters and afterwards, and so I can monitor what's going on, and you might visualize those while I'm recording because it's not line input, and bringing the volume slowly up from the VS instrument or the instrument itself, or the input on the audio interface if it's a line-in instrument. And that's very simple. It's not that complicated of an issue, and just making sure that the track's set up properly, and anything like on our DAW, it's the inspector to have that set up properly to be recording. And that's not that difficult. So we're ready to start recording. And the first thing, we've set the session up in those last few videos. The session's set up well and ready to go. We are ready to press the record button as far as the session in the studio. We're just ready to go. We've rechecked all musical notes, prepared, and organized, reviewed, and accepted. Plan for the session organized, agreed, structured, and agreed upon. Then we go through and start doing some checklists. Then we've checked the instrument and the vocalist. The instrument is good in working order as possible, tuned, adjusted, prepared, and it's got a good sound. The vocalist, the same thing, is in good shape, mentally and physically prepared. He's warmed up. He's ready to go. He's all comfortable and good to go. The VS instrument working, all the parameters set properly as best you can. Everything is set up. You have to understand what we talked about in the last video, or the video with the last video, we talked about the Howard Cosell effect. That his initial capture into the microphone that you was watching on CNN may not sound that good until they've done some processing on it. So keep that in mind. You're going to do processing on your vocals, your instrument, or your VST instrument later anyway to fine tune it to make it sound radio ready. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind. And you watch that last video before this video to refresh yourself on that. And then you've got the musician. Is he well practiced, for a good performance, for as good a performance as possible, for as good a capture as possible, for the timing to be as good as possible? And does everybody understand the material you're working with as well as possible? That's a huge step in your workflow to check. And then we go on to dealing with noise. All the doors closed, rooms sealed, whatever you have to do. Fans, air conditioners, heaters, other noise sources turned off or minimized as much as possible to reduce noise. A little bit of noise can cause saturation and distortions on your tracks, and you can hide it low pass filtered or stick in RX6, but it's better not to have to do that, and so you want to minimize it as much as possible. So that is the next step. Then you're going to go into checking the instrument. The instrument's in position, on, working properly and tested, type determined, agreed upon, anechoic chamber spatialization setting set up for the spatialization setting that you're going to capture. Recheck all settings for optimal sound effect, etc. You might want to put light reverb, and this goes in with whether you're doing this with the instrument, the amplifier, or the mic, so you have a little bit of spatialization. Put a light reverb on the track, but don't put it on the inputs because you might not want to print it on the track. Later on, you might want to adjust that, so don't put it there. Put it on the track so it doesn't print on there, so that it doesn't sound so dry. Like the vocalist singing, it sounds dry. Doesn't sound like Howard Cosell. Can you put a little bit of, can you throw an EQ on that track and a little bit of reverb to make it sound like Howard Cosell while I'm singing it? That's okay to fuss with it a little bit there, to do that kind of stuff, so that later on when you do some really sculpt on it and really fine tune it, that at least it sounds as good as possible while they're doing it. And test that. The same thing with the amplifier. You got the amplifier position on, work properly, to isolated, type determined, agreed upon, the spatialization setting agreed upon. Recheck all settings for sound, optimal sound and effect, and etc. And then again with the reverb, possibly EQ or something, on the track but not printed so that it doesn't sound so dry. And then the mic. We talked about mics on the last video, and don't make it a NASA project. Keep it simple, stupid, and use the equipment properly. The mic is in position, on, working properly, and tested. Type determined, agreed upon. The spatialization that you're going to record in, agreed upon and set up. And then recheck for optimal sound effect and things like that. And then we talked about a little bit of light reverb and EQ or something, on the track that's not going to get printed so it doesn't sound too dry again. So then we go to the performer, which can be you or whoever you're recording. The performer in good position, comfortable is a huge thing. So he's very comfortable and isolated the way he's supposed to be for the performance, the way you've got this session set up. Comfortable with the instrument, mic, etc. Positions for performance. He's all comfortable and ready to go. Get the performer's headphones on. Adjusted, tested for comfort. The performer comfortable with the audio feedback that he's getting from the system. Test it, check it out. Make sure he is. Have him do some warm-ups and, getting mentally prepared and relaxed, pumped up, getting a vibe going so he can do as good a performance as possible. So now while they are warming up and stuff like that, you want to go back and retest all your signal flow. And just be testing things while they're warming up and checking things and just rechecking things and rechecking things while they're doing stuff to make sure there's no problem until you don't have nothing else to check, and you've checked everything over and over again until it's set up well so you can get that really good capture, so you can have that really good material to work with later. And then you want to do that test capture. We talked about, recheck the input configurations like I talked about in the first video, and make sure that that's set up properly, and that it's working well, and you've, brought your line up into it, your trim pot until you've getting it set to where it is, and then start testing it. Testing it with the vocalist and things like that. To check the track configuration, armed, ready to go, and test it. Is it monitoring well in the headphones or whatever? Is it you hearing it well? And then do a test capture. and then analyze the test capture. Do a test capture, analyze it. After you've checked it for clipping, distortion, background noise, that you're getting good harmonic content, that you're looking at the waveform. If you go back and watch that first video, you'll see that target that you're looking for the most part. And it sounds good. Okay, it sounds good and it looks good across the capture, and go through the capture with the performer and finalize as acceptable. Just remember that it might be dry. If you got some reverberation and some EQ on the track that you're not printing it on there, without that, it might sound a little dry, so you may need to explain that to the performer or keep that in mind yourself, because it hasn't gone through processing yet, like Howard Cosell's voice on CNN Tonight. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind and relay that to the individuals you're working with. Now, another thing is I will do a sample for test processing. This is really simple. People that I'm recording, the vocalist, I have them sing an A, these normalized quiet parts, and a high note, high, that I capture on a separate track with the same configures for testing. Sometimes when you're testing those stuff, testing processing, testing sound sculpting, testing equalizations, reverberations, spatializations, compressions, things like that, it's easier to test it on a small test, on a test piece like that, like a bass note, ding, and have that on a separate track that you've captured well with the same setup, because it's easier to hear what your processing is doing to it on something like that. Sometimes in a performance, or the vocals, and then I went out to the side, and then it's hard to really hear exactly what's happening when you're trying to do your processing. But with some samples like that, it's really easy to go back and hear that bass note, ding, and you're, doing some, processing on it, or, equalization, whatever. It's easier to hear it rather than the dum bum bum ding ba bum bum bum. It's hard to hear what might be happening. So some tests, so you can test all that kind of stuff, ADSRs and all kinds of things, everything that you're going to be doing later on in the processing to be able to test it on those samples. And it's very important sometimes so that you can really get as good of processing later on as possible. And then you want to record it. We've gone through that, this kind of stuff, the instruments, performance, capture, and timing need to be as good as possible. Set a click track or drum track, set a 2-bar count in, and go. Get the performer mentally, physically ready and pumped up, and make sure he's really comfortable to get that really good performance so you get a really good capture, and then have them tell you when they are ready, or be ready if you're recording it. Be ready for it. Don't record if you ain't ready. Don't record him if he ain't ready. It sounds simple, but to make it part of your process and to check is a huge thing, so that you have so much better chance of getting a really good capture and material to work with later. Then record, bro. Hit the record, bro, and then analyze the track. Check it out. Go with the performance, listen to yourself, and agree that it sounds pretty good. You recorded the capture, it sounds great. If not, redo it. One thing to keep in mind on that is too many takes is going to cause bad captures and bad performances. 2 or 3 takes and it's going good, yeah. 5, 10, 15 takes, you're going to start out getting good captures, you're going to start out getting good performances, and it's better to walk away for a bit or walk away for a whole day and come back. And walk around the block a little bit, or have them walk around the block, or maybe come back tomorrow, so that you don't have a bunch of takes, because that can cause problems of you not getting what you're looking for. And then sometimes you want to do each section separately, the verse separately, the chorus separately, as separate takes, and have them, so that you can get optimal performance and optimal material and, captures to work with, and then, it's like, punching in parts. Get really well familiar with how to punch in parts. A drum hit, or the vocalist at this one part, it went, yeah, and it didn't sound quite right. And you're really good at just going, right there, 2-bar kind of, and give me that, yeah, right there, bro. Yeah, and if, and get it right. It's sometimes better to do some punch-ins than editing later and trying to fix stuff when you can just punch in a bass note or a small vocal section or a word or, a bass hit or a guitar chord or something like that. It's better to learn how to do that well, so you can do punch-ins to save yourself lots of problems later. And you might want to record those punch-ins on separate tracks and then bring them up onto the performance. Then finalize the tracks as acceptable with yourself and the performer to make sure they're as acceptable as possible. Recheck all track settings and routing properly set. Name the tracks, events, make sure that's all set. Make any notes about the captures that you need to make notes and be done with it. Clean up the session and be done right there. That's very simple. And off you go.